In August 2023, the United Kingdom watched the conclusion of one of the most disturbing and complex criminal trials in its recent history. For months, a courtroom heard detailed medical testimony, emotional statements from devastated families, and the analysis of specialists trying to explain something that seemed almost impossible to understand. At the center of everything was the name of Lucy Letby, a neonatal nurse who worked in what appeared to be an ordinary hospital in the north of England. To many people across Britain, it was almost unimaginable that someone whose job was to care for fragile newborn babies could be connected to crimes so serious. Yet after a lengthy trial, the jury delivered a devastating verdict. Letby was found guilty of murdering 7 babies and attempting to murder 6 others inside the neonatal unit of the Countess of Chester Hospital, where she worked between 2015 and 2016. The sentence that followed was one of the harshest possible under British law. The court ruled that Lucy Letby would spend the rest of her life in prison, with no possibility of parole. This type of sentence is extremely rare in the United Kingdom and is reserved only for the most serious crimes in the country. For many people, the case appeared to be closed. The narrative presented during the trial was that a seemingly ordinary nurse had carried out a series of silent attacks against the most vulnerable patients imaginable, premature babies receiving care in a neonatal unit. The prosecution described sudden and unexplained collapses, unusual medical events, and patterns that, according to them, pointed directly to the repeated presence of the same nurse during those incidents. Yet, from the beginning, there was something deeply unusual about this story. Unlike many serial murder cases where investigators eventually uncover clear motives such as money, revenge, ideology, or violent impulses, the trial of Lucy Letby produced no definitive explanation for why the crimes would have been committed. Even the prosecutors acknowledged that they could not establish a clear motive. Instead, they suggested several possible psychological explanations. Among them were theories such as boredom in the workplace, a search for excitement in what could otherwise be a routine hospital environment, or even a desire to exert absolute control over life and death situations, something that some experts described as playing God. Another theory raised during the trial involved what prosecutors described as an inappropriate emotional attachment between Letby and a married doctor who worked at the hospital and was present during some of the cases discussed in court. According to the prosecution, text messages exchanged between the two and a handwritten note discovered in Letby's home suggested a complicated emotional connection. In that note were phrases such as, "I trusted you with everything. You were my best friend, and please help me." Prosecutors interpreted these words as signs of a deep emotional reliance that may have influenced her behavior inside the hospital. Their theory suggested that Letby may have triggered medical emergencies so that the doctor would be present during those critical moments, potentially strengthening their connection through these crises. However, this interpretation was strongly rejected by Letby during the trial. She denied having any romantic relationship with the doctor and dismissed the suggestion that she had any emotional motive connected to him, stating that the messages had been taken out of context. The absence of a clear motive led commentators and criminology experts to compare the case with other historical incidents involving healthcare workers accused of killing patients. One case frequently mentioned was that of Beverly Allitt, a British nurse who in 1991 was convicted of murdering children in a pediatric hospital ward. Allitt also worked in a hospital environment and targeted extremely vulnerable patients, leading some specialists to speculate that Lucy Letby may have followed a similar psychological pattern. Some criminal psychologists also suggested the possibility of a condition known as factitious disorder imposed on another, a psychological disorder in which a person deliberately causes illness or injury in someone else in order to gain attention or sympathy. However, no official psychiatric diagnosis presented in court confirmed that Letby suffered from such a disorder. Other experts offered a different explanation known as the hero complex. According to this theory, certain individuals may create emergencies in order to later participate in the rescue, placing themselves in a position where they appear heroic to colleagues and supervisors. This idea was mentioned by criminologists who publicly analyzed the case after the trial concluded. Yet, like the other explanations, this remained only a theoretical possibility, and was never definitively proven in court. As a result, one of the most fundamental questions, the motive behind the crimes, remained unanswered, something extremely unusual in cases of this magnitude. And while the trial appeared to bring the story to an official conclusion, what happened afterward began to raise new questions that few people had expected. As medical experts, statisticians, and researchers started reviewing the evidence presented during the trial, certain concerns began to emerge. Questions were raised about the reliability of some of the medical tests used in court. Others questioned how hospital data had been interpreted and whether certain scientific theories used to explain the deaths were medically plausible. Perhaps most importantly, a growing number of specialists began to ask whether one of the most shocking criminal cases in recent British history might not be as straightforward as it first appeared. Because while many people saw Lucy Letby as a convicted killer, responsible for unimaginable crimes against helpless babies, others began to consider a far more unsettling possibility. That something in the investigation, the medical evidence, or even the trial itself might have gone terribly wrong. And if that possibility turned out to be true, it would mean that the story was not really over, but instead was only beginning to reveal its most troubling questions. In the months following the verdict, the case that had seemed so definitive began to attract a new kind of attention. Journalists, medical researchers, statisticians, and legal analysts started examining the evidence that had been presented during the trial. At first, the discussion remained relatively quiet, confined mostly to academic circles and specialized publications. But gradually, a pattern began to emerge. Some experts were raising concerns about the medical conclusions that had played a crucial role in securing the conviction of Lucy Letby. These were not casual observations or internet speculation. They were questions coming from professionals who had spent decades studying neonatal medicine, pathology, and clinical data. As their analyses began to circulate more widely, the narrative that had once appeared so clear started to look far more complicated. One of the earliest points of scrutiny involved the medical evidence used to support the claim that 2 babies had been poisoned with insulin. During the trial, prosecutors argued that blood test results showed unusually high insulin levels combined with extremely low blood sugar, a combination they claimed could only be explained by the deliberate administration of insulin. This allegation was one of the most serious presented in court because it suggested an intentional act rather than a natural medical complication. However, after the trial concluded, several specialists began questioning whether the tests used to detect insulin were reliable enough to support such a conclusion in a criminal case. Some laboratory experts pointed out that the specific assay used in those tests was known to produce misleading results under certain conditions, especially when analyzing samples from premature infants whose metabolic systems function very differently from those of older children or adults. Further concerns emerged when it was revealed that the laboratory responsible for conducting the tests had guidelines recommending a second, more precise confirmatory analysis whenever external insulin was suspected. According to critics of the evidence, that additional confirmatory test was never performed. This detail quickly became a central issue among experts reviewing the case. Without that second test, some argued, it was impossible to state with absolute certainty that the insulin detected in the blood samples had come from an external source. Even more troubling for some analysts was the discovery that around the same period, the same laboratory had recorded a quality control anomaly in which insulin readings were incorrectly elevated. That information, according to reports, had not been presented to the jury during the trial. At the same time, specialists in neonatal physiology began raising another question. Even if the insulin readings were accurate, did they necessarily prove that someone had injected insulin into the babies? Premature infants often experience unstable blood sugar levels due to their underdeveloped metabolic systems. In neonatal intensive care units, episodes of hypoglycemia can occur for a wide range of medical reasons, including infections, feeding difficulties, organ immaturity, and complications related to birth trauma. Some experts argued that these alternative explanations had not been fully explored in court. Others pointed out that investigators had not identified any missing insulin supplies from the hospital that could be linked to the alleged incidents. The controversy surrounding the insulin evidence soon became one of the most debated aspects of the entire case. Among those examining it closely were researchers who specialized in the physiology of insulin regulation in premature babies. Their analysis suggested that the prosecution may have relied on medical assumptions based largely on studies involving adults or older children rather than extremely premature infants. Because the biology of newborns is significantly different, these experts warned that conclusions drawn from adult data might not apply in the same way to neonatal patients. The result was a growing scientific debate over whether the evidence that had been presented to the jury was as definitive as it had initially appeared. While these discussions were unfolding, other aspects of the prosecution's medical theories were also beginning to attract scrutiny. In several of the cases presented during the trial, prosecutors argued that babies had suffered sudden collapses due to air being deliberately introduced into their bodies. The suggestion was that air had been injected either into their bloodstream or into their stomachs through feeding tubes, causing catastrophic medical events. During the trial, these explanations were presented as plausible mechanisms of harm, but after the verdict, some neonatologists began expressing strong doubts about whether such scenarios could actually occur in the ways described. A number of specialists described the theory that air had been deliberately injected through nasogastric feeding tubes as medically implausible. According to these critics, the amount of air that would be required to cause fatal damage through a feeding tube would likely produce obvious clinical signs long before it became lethal. Some experts went even further, describing the explanation as unrealistic or inconsistent with established neonatal physiology. Their skepticism added another layer of uncertainty to the growing debate over the medical evidence used in the trial. At the center of this emerging controversy was a respected Canadian neonatologist, Shu Lee, whose research had been cited during the prosecution's case. His earlier academic work had been referenced in court to support the idea that certain skin discolorations observed in some of the babies were indicative of a rare condition known as air embolism. However, after learning that his research had been used during the trial, Lee publicly expressed concern that his study might have been misinterpreted. According to him, the symptoms described in the court proceedings did not match the patterns he had documented in his original research. This revelation marked a turning point in the post-trial discussion. If the medical interpretation of the evidence was being questioned by the very scientists whose research had been used to support the prosecution's case, then the reliability of those conclusions suddenly became a matter of serious debate. Slowly but steadily, the case that had once seemed like a clear example of a hospital serial killer began to take on a different tone in public discourse. Instead of focusing solely on the horrifying possibility that a nurse had murdered newborn babies, a new and deeply unsettling question was beginning to emerge. What if the medical explanations presented during the trial were wrong? And if even some of those explanations turned out to be flawed, it could mean that the entire case rested on a foundation far less certain than anyone had realized at the time of the verdict. As the scientific debate surrounding the case intensified, more specialists began examining the medical explanations that had been presented during the trial. What initially appeared to be isolated concerns slowly developed into a broader reassessment of several key conclusions that had influenced the conviction of Lucy Letby. In particular, experts started focusing on the theory that some of the babies had died from a rare and dramatic medical event known as air embolism, a condition in which air enters the bloodstream and blocks circulation in vital organs. During the trial, the prosecution argued that the unusual skin discoloration observed in several babies was consistent with this type of event. According to the narrative presented in court, air had somehow been deliberately introduced into the baby's systems, leading to sudden collapses and ultimately death. The prosecution's medical experts suggested that these events could not be explained by natural causes and instead indicated deliberate harm. For the jury, these conclusions were presented as part of a broader pattern that connected multiple incidents to the presence of the same nurse during critical moments in the neonatal unit. However, after the trial concluded, the interpretation of those symptoms began to face increasing scrutiny. One of the most significant voices in this discussion was Shu Lee, a respected neonatologist whose academic research had been referenced in the courtroom. His earlier study, published decades earlier, had examined cases of air embolism in newborn infants. During the prosecution's arguments, that research was cited as supporting evidence for the claim that certain patterns of skin discoloration observed in the babies could be a sign of air embolism. But when Lee later became aware that his work had been used in this way, he expressed serious concerns. According to him, the symptoms described during the trial did not correspond with the patterns documented in his original research. In interviews after the verdict, Lee stated that the type of skin discoloration described in court was not, in his opinion, consistent with air embolism. He also criticized the approach of diagnosing such a condition primarily by ruling out other possibilities, rather than by identifying clear, direct medical evidence. For many observers, this moment marked a significant shift in how the case was being discussed in scientific circles. If the very study used to support a crucial medical theory had been interpreted incorrectly, then the reliability of that theory became highly questionable. And air embolism had not been a minor detail in the trial. It had been one of the explanations used to account for the sudden and unexplained collapses of several babies. Other medical professionals soon joined the discussion, examining the broader context of the evidence. Some neonatologists pointed out that premature infants in intensive care units often suffer unpredictable medical crises due to their fragile physiology. Extremely premature babies may experience rapid deterioration from infections, organ immaturity, complications from birth trauma, or respiratory instability. In such environments, sudden medical emergencies are tragically not uncommon, even when care is provided correctly. This reality led some critics to question whether the prosecution had adequately ruled out natural medical explanations before concluding that deliberate harm had occurred. In complex medical environments, such as neonatal intensive care units, multiple factors can interact in ways that make outcomes difficult to predict. What might appear to be a suspicious pattern could, under closer statistical analysis, turn out to be the result of normal variations within a high-risk patient population. The debate grew even more intense when attention turned to the statistical evidence presented during the trial. One of the key arguments made by prosecutors was that Lucy Letby had been present during every suspicious incident involving the babies. To illustrate this, investigators presented a chart showing the shifts worked by Letby alongside the timing of the medical emergencies. At first glance, the chart appeared striking. It seemed to show a clear and alarming pattern. Whenever something catastrophic happened in the neonatal unit, Letby was there. Yet statisticians reviewing the case later argued that the presentation of this data might have been misleading. Some critics pointed out that the chart included only certain selected incidents rather than all medical events that had occurred during the period in question. If investigators had already identified those cases as suspicious before constructing the chart, then the data might simply reflect the initial assumption rather than prove it. In statistics, this type of reasoning is sometimes referred to as the Texas sharpshooter fallacy, a situation in which patterns are identified only after the data has been selectively chosen. Additional questions emerged regarding how frequently different staff members worked shifts in the neonatal unit. If Letby had simply worked more shifts than other nurses during that period, it might increase the probability that she would be present during medical emergencies purely by chance. Without a full statistical context, including the schedules of all staff members and the total number of medical incidents, some statisticians argued that it was impossible to determine whether the pattern presented in court was truly unusual. For critics of the conviction, these issues raised a deeply troubling possibility that what had appeared to be a clear pattern of criminal behavior might instead be a combination of complex medical events and statistical coincidence. For supporters of the verdict, however, the evidence presented during the trial still pointed to a series of events too unusual to be explained by chance alone. As the debate continued to unfold, one thing became increasingly clear. The case of Lucy Letby was no longer just a criminal investigation. It had evolved into a much larger and far more complicated discussion involving medicine, statistics, psychology, and the reliability of expert testimony in court. And as more specialists began examining the evidence piece by piece, a question that few people had initially considered started to take shape. What if the events that had shocked an entire nation were not the result of a hidden killer inside the hospital, but instead the consequence of something far less visible and far more difficult to detect? A catastrophic failure in how complex medical evidence had been interpreted in a courtroom. As experts continued reviewing the medical and statistical evidence, attention slowly began shifting toward another crucial aspect of the case: the conditions inside the hospital itself. The neonatal unit where the incidents occurred was part of the Countess of Chester Hospital, a facility that, like many hospitals across the United Kingdom, was operating under significant pressure during that period. When journalists and medical professionals started examining internal reports, staffing records, and previous inspections, a broader picture of the working environment inside the unit began to emerge. Neonatal intensive care units are among the most demanding medical environments in any hospital. The patients are often extremely premature infants whose bodies are still in the earliest stages of development. Many of them depend on ventilators, feeding tubes, intravenous medications, and constant monitoring simply to survive. In such fragile conditions, even small complications can quickly escalate into life-threatening emergencies. Because of this, neonatal units require not only advanced equipment, but also highly trained staff and sufficient medical coverage to respond rapidly to crises. However, reports that surfaced after the trial suggested that the neonatal unit in Chester had been struggling with chronic staffing shortages during the period when the incidents occurred. Some accounts describe doctors and nurses working under intense pressure, often responsible for more patients than recommended. In one review conducted by the Royal College of Pediatrics and Child Health, investigators found that staffing levels in the hospital had at times been inadequate for the level of care required by the patients in the unit. The report also noted that the hospital had only a limited number of specialist neonatal doctors available, which meant that the medical team was frequently stretched thin. For critics examining the case after the verdict, these details raised a difficult question. If the neonatal unit had been operating under severe pressure, could systemic problems within the hospital have contributed to some of the tragic outcomes that later became central to the criminal investigation? In highly complex medical environments, factors such as staff fatigue, communication breakdowns, or delayed responses to complications can sometimes play a role in unexpected medical crises. While such issues do not necessarily explain individual cases on their own, they can create circumstances in which adverse events become more likely. Other concerns involved the hospital's infrastructure. Reports indicated that the facility had experienced recurring maintenance problems during the period when the incidents occurred. Some accounts described doctors and nurses working under intense pressure, often responsible for more patients than recommended. In one review conducted by the Royal College of Pediatrics and Child Health, investigators found that staffing levels in the hospital had at times been inadequate for the level of care required by the patients in the unit. The report also noted that the hospital had only a limited number of specialist neonatal doctors available, which meant that the medical team was frequently stretched thin. For critics examining the case after the verdict, these details raised a difficult question. If the neonatal unit had been operating under severe pressure, could systemic problems within the hospital have contributed to some of the tragic outcomes that later became central to the criminal investigation? In highly complex medical environments, factors such as staff fatigue, communication breakdowns, or delayed responses to complications can sometimes play a role in unexpected medical crises. While such issues do not necessarily explain individual cases on their own, they can create circumstances in which adverse events become more likely. Other concerns involved the hospital's infrastructure. Reports indicated that the facility had experienced recurring maintenance problems during the period when the incidents occurred. Some accounts described issues with plumbing systems that occasionally caused sewage backflow into sinks within certain areas of the hospital. While this problem might appear unrelated at first glance, hospital hygiene systems are critically important in environments where premature infants with weakened immune systems are being treated. Even minor contamination risks can become serious in neonatal units, where patients are extremely vulnerable to infection. These details attracted particular attention when later reports suggested that the hospital may have experienced a dangerous bacterial outbreak during roughly the same period in which the babies died. According to documents that later surfaced in the media, the neonatal unit had dealt with a significant presence of harmful bacteria. Critics argued that such infections could potentially explain sudden deteriorations in fragile newborns. Some microbiologists reviewing the case suggested that infectious disease should have been examined more thoroughly as a possible contributing factor to the cluster of deaths. Another detail that drew attention involved a previous incident at the hospital before the period examined in the trial. In an earlier case investigated through a medical inquest, a baby had died after a breathing tube had been inserted incorrectly. While this incident was not directly connected to the later criminal investigation, it demonstrated that serious medical complications could occur in the unit under certain circumstances. For those questioning the conclusions of the trial, this history reinforced the possibility that not every tragic event in the neonatal ward necessarily indicated deliberate harm. The growing focus on hospital conditions did not automatically mean that the criminal verdict was wrong. Supporters of the conviction pointed out that medical environments often face operational challenges without producing patterns of deaths that appear suspicious. From their perspective, the key issue remained the cluster of unexplained collapses that investigators believed had occurred during the shifts of Lucy Letby. They argued that systemic problems alone could not fully account for the specific incidents examined in court. Nevertheless, the discussion about hospital conditions introduced a new dimension to the case. Instead of focusing solely on the actions of a single nurse, some experts began examining whether a combination of medical complexity, systemic stress, and fragile patients might have created circumstances that were later interpreted in a very different way. In high-risk medical environments, distinguishing between tragic natural outcomes and deliberate actions can sometimes be extraordinarily difficult. As these questions circulated in medical journals, investigative reports, and public debates, the case continued to evolve far beyond the courtroom where the original verdict had been delivered. It was no longer just a story about a nurse accused of committing unthinkable crimes. It was becoming a much larger discussion about how modern medicine, scientific evidence, and the justice system intersect, and what can happen when those worlds collide under the pressure of a national tragedy. But even as attention turned to hospital conditions and medical complexities, another revelation was about to surface, one that would raise fresh doubts about a different piece of evidence used during the investigation. Evidence that investigators had relied on to determine exactly where people were inside the hospital at critical moments. And when that information was re-examined, something unexpected came to light. As the debate around medical evidence and hospital conditions continued to grow, another aspect of the investigation began to attract attention: the digital records used to track movements inside the neonatal unit. During the trial, prosecutors relied in part on electronic access logs from the hospital to establish when staff members entered or exited certain areas of the ward. These records were created by the hospital's security system, which required staff to use electronic keycards to open specific doors within the facility. By analyzing these logs, investigators attempted to reconstruct who was present in the neonatal unit at particular moments when medical emergencies occurred. At first glance, the data appeared to support the prosecution's narrative. According to the timeline presented during the trial, Lucy Letby had been present in the unit during several of the incidents under investigation. Combined with the medical testimony and the statistical charts shown to the jury, these access records helped reinforce the argument that the same nurse had repeatedly been nearby whenever babies suddenly deteriorated. For investigators, the logs seemed to offer an objective record, a digital trail documenting movements within the hospital during critical periods. However, after the trials had concluded, new information about those records began to surface. In August 2024, prosecutors confirmed that data from at least one of the hospital's door access systems had been incorrectly labeled, Specifically, the entries that were supposed to indicate when someone had entered the neonatal unit had been reversed with the records showing when someone had exited. In other words, the direction of movement recorded in the system had been interpreted incorrectly. This meant that some of the data used to establish timelines inside the unit could potentially have been misunderstood. The revelation immediately raised concerns among those reviewing the case. Electronic access systems are often considered reliable tools for reconstructing movements in secure environments such as hospitals, airports, or research facilities. But if the data itself had been labeled incorrectly, then the conclusions drawn from that information might not be as certain as originally believed. According to later reports, the incorrectly labeled records had been used in relation to multiple incidents discussed during the investigation. Even more complicated was the fact that not every entrance to the neonatal unit had been equipped with a logging system. While some doors required electronic card access, others did not record movements at all. This meant that the available data could only capture part of the overall activity within the unit. Staff members might have entered or exited through other routes without leaving any digital trace in the system. As a result, the access logs could not provide a complete picture of who was present at every moment. For critics examining the case, these limitations highlighted the difficulty of reconstructing events inside a busy hospital environment. Neonatal units operate continuously, with nurses, doctors, technicians, and other staff members moving frequently between rooms to respond to alarms, monitor patients, and perform procedures. In such dynamic settings, establishing exact timelines can be challenging even when detailed records are available. Supporters of the original verdict argued that the access log issue did not fundamentally change the broader body of evidence presented during the trial. They pointed out that the prosecution's case had relied on multiple types of evidence, including medical testimony, clinical records, and witness statements. From this perspective, the door access data represented only one element of a much larger investigation. Correcting the labeling error, they argued, would not necessarily overturn the conclusions reached by the jury. But for others, the discovery reinforced a broader concern that had been developing since the verdict. If certain pieces of evidence required reinterpretation after the trial, then it raised questions about how confidently the overall timeline of events could be reconstructed. In complex cases involving scientific data, even small technical misunderstandings can sometimes influence how patterns are perceived. At the same time, another controversial piece of evidence from the trial continued to be debated: a series of handwritten notes discovered in Lucy Letby's home during the police investigation. During the trial, prosecutors had presented these notes as deeply incriminating, suggesting that they reflected the thoughts of someone struggling with guilt. Among the phrases written on the papers were statements such as "I am evil and I did this," which were interpreted by the prosecution as indications of a confession. Yet after the verdict, some psychologists and forensic specialists began offering a different interpretation. Experts in forensic psychology pointed out that the same notes also contained sentences denying responsibility, alongside expressions of distress, confusion, and emotional turmoil. According to these specialists, the writings could be consistent with someone experiencing extreme psychological pressure rather than someone admitting guilt. Further reporting later suggested that the notes had been written during a period when Letby had been encouraged to write down her thoughts as part of a therapeutic process. Mental health professionals sometimes recommend journaling as a way for individuals to process overwhelming emotions, especially when they are facing intense accusations or public scrutiny. In such contexts, written statements may reflect internal fears or intrusive thoughts rather than literal confessions. As these competing interpretations circulated in the media and among experts, the case continued to evolve into something far more complicated than a single criminal trial. Instead of a straightforward narrative, the story now involved layers of medical science, statistical reasoning, psychological interpretation, and institutional pressures within a healthcare system. And as more specialists began examining the evidence from different angles, one development would soon push the debate into an entirely new phase. A review conducted by an international panel of medical experts determined to re-examine every single case connected to the investigation. Their findings would soon spark one of the most dramatic controversies the case had seen so far. By the beginning of 2025, the controversy surrounding the case had grown far beyond the courtroom where the original verdict had been delivered. What had started as a handful of questions from individual specialists had gradually evolved into a broader international discussion involving neonatologists, statisticians, forensic scientists, and legal experts. Many of these professionals were not directly connected to the trial itself, but they had followed the case closely and were increasingly concerned about how some of the medical evidence had been interpreted. At the center of this new development was a decision made by the Canadian neonatologist Shu Lee, whose earlier research had played an unexpected role in the courtroom arguments. Lee had first learned that his academic work had been cited during the prosecution's case only after the trial had already concluded. When he reviewed how his study had been used to support certain medical conclusions, he became concerned that the findings might have been misapplied. In particular, the references to air embolism, a rare but serious medical condition involving air entering the bloodstream, did not appear to match the symptoms described in the babies whose cases had been discussed in court. These concerns led Lee to take an unusual step. Instead of simply commenting publicly on the matter, he decided to organize an independent review of the evidence with the help of other medical specialists. Lee invited a group of experts from several countries to participate in what would become a comprehensive re-examination of the cases connected to the conviction of Lucy Letby. The panel ultimately included 14 specialists from 6 different nations, representing fields such as neonatology, pediatrics, pathology, and neonatal intensive care. According to reports, these experts agreed to review the available medical records, witness testimony, and clinical details related to the incidents that had formed the basis of the trial. Importantly, the panel members were not paid for their participation. The organizers stated that the group's objective was simply to evaluate the medical evidence as objectively as possible. The experts also agreed in advance that their conclusions would be published, regardless of whether they supported or contradicted the verdict that had been reached in the British court. This commitment to transparency was intended to reinforce the credibility of the review and to ensure that the findings would be based solely on the scientific analysis of the available data. When the panel completed its work, the conclusions it presented were striking. According to the group's assessment, none of the cases they examined contained clear medical evidence of deliberate harm. Instead, the panel argued that the deaths and medical crises described in the trial could be explained by a combination of natural medical causes, complications associated with extreme prematurity, and potential shortcomings in the care environment within the hospital. In their view, the available records did not demonstrate the presence of intentional actions designed to harm the babies. These findings were announced during a press conference attended by Lee and several figures connected to the legal campaign seeking to re-examine the case. During that event, Lee stated that after reviewing the clinical information, the panel had found no evidence that any of the babies had been murdered. According to him, each incident could be explained through natural medical processes or by factors related to the challenges of caring for extremely fragile premature infants. The announcement immediately reignited the debate that had been building in the months after the trial. For critics of the conviction, the panel's conclusions appeared to confirm many of the concerns that had already been raised about the interpretation of medical evidence. They argued that the findings suggested the possibility of a serious miscarriage of justice, a situation in which a person might have been convicted based on scientific conclusions that were later disputed by other experts. Supporters of the original verdict, however, responded with caution. Some pointed out that the panel had not been part of the original judicial process and had relied on records provided by the defense team. Others emphasized that the British jury had heard months of testimony from multiple experts before reaching its decision. From their perspective, the independent review did not necessarily invalidate the conclusions that had been reached in court. Despite these disagreements, the panel's work had a significant impact on the public discussion surrounding the case. The fact that a large group of international medical experts had reviewed the evidence and reached such strong conclusions ensured that the controversy would continue. Media outlets across the United Kingdom and beyond began covering the debate in greater detail, and the case once again returned to the center of national attention. At the same time, legal efforts were underway to bring the new analysis into the formal justice system. Lawyers representing Lucy Letby submitted the panel's findings as part of a request for the case to be examined by the Criminal Cases Review Commission, the independent organization responsible for investigating possible wrongful convictions in the United Kingdom. The Commission has the authority to review criminal cases when new evidence or new arguments raise concerns about the safety of a conviction. If it concludes that a miscarriage of justice may have occurred, it can refer the case back to the courts for further consideration. As the Commission began evaluating the request, the situation reached an extraordinary point. A nurse who had already received one of the most severe sentences in British history was now at the center of a debate that involved international medical experts, legal authorities, and a public struggling to understand what had truly happened inside a neonatal unit years earlier. And as investigators, scientists, and journalists continued to examine the case from every angle, one possibility loomed over the entire discussion. A possibility that, if proven true, would shake the foundations of the original verdict. The possibility that one of the most shocking criminal cases in modern British history might not yet be fully understood. By the time the international panel's findings became public, the case had evolved into something far larger than a single criminal conviction. What had once appeared to be a resolved tragedy had now turned into a deeply polarizing national debate. Across the United Kingdom, journalists, legal scholars, doctors, and members of the public began discussing the same unsettling question. Had the justice system correctly identified a serial killer inside a neonatal unit, or had a catastrophic mistake been made in interpreting complex medical evidence? At the center of the legal process now stood the Criminal Cases Review Commission, the independent authority responsible for investigating possible wrongful convictions in England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. The Commission exists precisely for situations like this, cases in which new evidence or expert analysis raises serious doubts about the safety of a verdict. Once a case is submitted, the Commission examines the available material, consults specialists if necessary, and determines whether the conviction should be referred back to the courts for reconsideration. For Lucy Letby, this process represented one of the last legal avenues through which her case could potentially be reopened. Her legal team argued that the international panel's conclusions, combined with the growing criticism of the medical and statistical evidence presented during the trial, justified a full review of the conviction. They maintained that the jury had never heard several important scientific perspectives, and that some aspects of the evidence might have been misunderstood or incomplete. Yet while these legal arguments were unfolding, another dimension of the story was becoming increasingly visible: the emotional impact on the families whose children had died. For the parents who had already endured unimaginable loss, the renewed public debate was deeply painful. Many of them had sat through months of testimony during the original trial, listening to the details of what prosecutors described as deliberate attacks on their babies. For these families, the verdict had brought a measure of closure, however limited it might have been. The suggestion that the case might now be questioned reopened wounds that had never fully healed. Lawyers representing several of the families spoke publicly about the distress caused by speculation surrounding the conviction. Some described the emerging theories questioning the verdict as deeply upsetting for parents who believed the court had already established the truth about what had happened. From their perspective, the focus should remain on the suffering experienced by the babies and their families, rather than on debates about scientific interpretations. At the same time, others argued that questioning evidence in controversial cases is an essential part of a functioning justice system. Legal scholars pointed out that history contains several examples in which convictions involving medical professionals were later overturned after new scientific analysis emerged. One of the most frequently cited examples involved a Dutch nurse whose conviction for multiple patient deaths was eventually reversed when statistical evidence used during the trial was later shown to be flawed. Cases like that, critics argued, demonstrated how complex medical data can sometimes be misinterpreted when presented in a legal context. The debate soon expanded beyond academic circles and entered the broader public conversation. Television programs, newspapers, and investigative magazines began examining different aspects of the case in detail. Some reporters revisited the original evidence presented during the trial, while others focused on the new analyses produced by specialists who had not been involved in the courtroom proceedings. The result was a national discussion in which competing interpretations of the same events were being presented side by side. Within the medical community, opinions were also divided. Some doctors maintained that the pattern of unexplained collapses described during the trial remained highly suspicious and difficult to attribute entirely to natural causes. Others believed that the evidence had never conclusively demonstrated deliberate harm, and that the deaths might instead reflect the unpredictable realities of neonatal medicine. For professionals who regularly work in intensive care units for premature infants, the case raised troubling questions about how medical outcomes are interpreted when tragedy strikes. Meanwhile, public perception of the case became increasingly complex. For many people, the idea that a nurse could secretly harm vulnerable babies was almost impossible to comprehend. Yet the court had already delivered a conviction based on months of testimony and deliberation. At the same time, the growing number of experts questioning the evidence made it difficult to ignore the possibility that the story might not be as straightforward as it first appeared. In situations like this, the legal system moves slowly and carefully. The Criminal Cases Review Commission does not reopen cases lightly, and its investigations often take months or even years. During that time, specialists may review medical records again, analyze statistical data, and examine whether new evidence could realistically influence the outcome of a trial if it were presented to a jury. As this process continues, the case remains suspended in a state of uncertainty. The original conviction still stands, and Lucy Letby continues to serve her life sentence in prison. Yet the debate surrounding the evidence has ensured that the story remains far from settled in the minds of many observers. What began as a tragic series of deaths in a neonatal unit has now become one of the most complex and controversial criminal cases in modern British history. It is a story about medicine, law, science, and human tragedy. A case that forces society to confront difficult questions about how truth is determined, when lives, evidence, and emotions are all intertwined. And until the final chapter is written by the justice system itself, the most unsettling question remains unanswered. Did the courts uncover the actions of a hidden killer, or is the full truth of what happened inside that hospital still waiting to be discovered? Even after the verdict, the appeals, and the international debate, the story of Lucy Letby remains surrounded by unanswered questions. In the courtroom, the legal process reached a conclusion. A jury listened to months of testimony, examined evidence, and ultimately delivered a verdict that resulted in one of the harshest sentences ever imposed in the British justice system. From a legal standpoint, the case was closed. But outside the courtroom, the discussion never truly stopped. At the center of that ongoing debate is the complex intersection between medicine and law. Neonatal intensive care is one of the most delicate and unpredictable areas of modern healthcare. The patients are extremely premature infants whose bodies are still developing and whose survival often depends on fragile medical interventions. Even in the best hospitals, sudden collapses and unexplained complications can occur. For doctors and nurses working in these units, every shift involves managing risks that can change in seconds. During the trial, prosecutors argued that the pattern of collapses and deaths inside the neonatal unit could not be explained by natural causes alone. They presented expert testimony suggesting that some of the babies had been deliberately harmed, including allegations involving air embolisms, insulin poisoning, and other forms of interference. According to the prosecution, the repeated presence of Letby during several of these incidents was not a coincidence, but evidence of a calculated pattern. However, critics of the case have focused on a different aspect of the story: the interpretation of medical evidence. Some specialists have argued that the symptoms described during the trial could have multiple possible explanations, particularly in premature infants who are already medically unstable. They suggest that what appeared suspicious in hindsight might actually reflect complications that can occur in neonatal intensive care units under certain circumstances. These disagreements highlight a broader challenge that legal systems face when dealing with highly technical scientific evidence. Judges and juries must rely on expert testimony to interpret complex medical data, yet experts themselves do not always agree. In some cases, two specialists reviewing the same clinical records may arrive at entirely different conclusions about what caused a patient's death. When that happens, determining the truth becomes extraordinarily difficult. The role of statistics in the case has also been widely debated. During the investigation, doctors noticed that several of the incidents had occurred while Letby was on duty. Prosecutors argued that this pattern was unlikely to be random, but some statisticians later warned that analyzing patterns in small data sets can be misleading. In environments like hospitals, where staff members often work similar shifts and respond to emergencies together, apparent correlations may not necessarily indicate causation. The hospital itself also became part of the broader discussion. The neonatal unit at the Countess of Chester Hospital had previously faced challenges related to staffing levels and the availability of senior specialists. Reviews conducted before the police investigation identified concerns about communication between medical staff and hospital management. Some analysts have suggested that systemic problems within the unit may have contributed to the circumstances surrounding the deaths and collapses that triggered the investigation in the first place. At the same time, others argue that these institutional issues do not explain the specific medical findings presented during the trial. For supporters of the original verdict, the pattern of incidents and the expert testimony provided in court remain powerful evidence that deliberate harm occurred. They maintain that the jury, after hearing all the arguments and examining the evidence, reached a justified conclusion. For the families whose children died or suffered medical crises, the debate carries an emotional weight that extends far beyond legal analysis. Many parents spent years searching for answers about what had happened to their babies. The criminal trial brought a form of recognition that something terrible had occurred, and for some families the verdict represented a moment of accountability after years of uncertainty. But the renewed scrutiny of the evidence has complicated that sense of closure. Every new expert opinion, every article questioning the interpretation of medical data, and every legal review has the potential to reopen wounds for families who have already endured profound loss. Their experiences remain at the heart of the story, even as the legal and scientific debates continue. Meanwhile, the case has sparked broader conversations within healthcare systems around the world. Hospitals have begun examining how unusual patterns of patient deaths are investigated, and how concerns raised by medical staff are handled by administrators. Professional organizations have also discussed the need for clearer guidelines when complex medical evidence is presented in criminal trials. In the end, the case represents far more than the story of one nurse or one hospital. It reveals the enormous difficulty of determining truth in situations where medicine, statistics, human behavior, and tragedy intersect. Courts are designed to reach conclusions based on the evidence available at the time, but scientific understanding can evolve, and new interpretations can emerge long after a verdict has been delivered. For now, the conviction of Lucy Letby remains in place, and the legal process has largely run its course. Yet the debate surrounding the case continues to unfold among doctors, lawyers, researchers, and journalists who are still trying to understand every detail of what happened. Because in a story like this, the most unsettling possibility is not simply that something terrible occurred inside a hospital ward. It is the possibility that the full truth, whatever it may ultimately be, has not yet been completely revealed. As the debate surrounding the conviction of Lucy Letby continued, attention increasingly shifted away from the individual case and toward the broader systems that had allowed the tragedy to unfold. What began as a criminal investigation gradually exposed deeper concerns about hospital governance, accountability, and how warning signs inside complex healthcare environments are handled. One of the most significant criticisms emerged from within the medical community itself. Several doctors, who had raised early concerns about the unusual pattern of infant collapses, later stated that their warnings had not initially been taken seriously by hospital leadership. According to their accounts, repeated attempts to escalate concerns were met with hesitation and internal reviews rather than immediate external investigation. The hospital at the center of the case, the Countess of Chester Hospital, eventually did remove Letby from clinical duties in 2016. However, by that point, the pattern of incidents had already persisted for many months. This delay became one of the most controversial aspects of the entire situation. Critics argued that earlier intervention might have prevented additional tragedies, while hospital administrators maintained that they had acted based on the information available at the time. The controversy revealed a structural issue that exists within many large healthcare organizations: the difficulty of responding quickly to suspicions involving members of medical staff. Hospitals must balance patient safety with legal protections for employees. Accusing a healthcare worker of wrongdoing without clear evidence carries serious professional and legal consequences. As a result, administrators often rely on internal reviews and expert consultations before escalating concerns to law enforcement. In the aftermath of the trial, several professional organizations began calling for reforms to address these challenges. The British Medical Association publicly argued that hospital executives and administrators should face clearer mechanisms of accountability when serious management failures occur. The organization suggested that healthcare leaders should be subject to professional oversight, similar to the regulatory frameworks already applied to doctors and nurses. These calls were echoed by Rob Behrens, who warned that the case exposed serious weaknesses in the way concerns are handled within the National Health Service. According to Behrens, meaningful reform would be necessary to prevent similar situations from occurring in the future. His comments reflected a broader recognition that the case had revealed systemic vulnerabilities within the healthcare system. Another controversial question involved the potential responsibility of hospital leadership during the period when the deaths occurred. Some experts suggested that the situation might warrant examination under laws related to corporate negligence, particularly if institutional failures had contributed to the delay in responding to warnings. Among those raising this possibility was the pediatric expert Dewey Evans, who had played a role during the investigation by reviewing medical records connected to the case. As these discussions unfolded, regulatory bodies also began examining the actions of hospital managers who had been responsible for overseeing the neonatal unit during the relevant period. One senior nursing executive who had worked at the hospital was later suspended from a subsequent leadership position at another healthcare organization after information revealed during the trial prompted further scrutiny. The Nursing and Midwifery Council confirmed that it would investigate whether professional standards had been upheld. These developments illustrated how the consequences of the case were spreading far beyond the courtroom. What had started as a criminal prosecution was now triggering investigations into leadership decisions, regulatory oversight, and institutional culture within the healthcare system. For policymakers, the situation highlighted the importance of creating environments where medical staff feel able to report concerns without fear of professional repercussions. Another issue that attracted public attention involved financial consequences following the conviction. Reports indicated that the government was examining whether Letby's pension from the National Health Service could be legally withdrawn under existing regulations. In certain cases involving serious criminal convictions, pension benefits linked to public employment can be revoked. The possibility that this measure might be applied became another reminder of how severe the legal consequences of the case had become. At the same time, the government announced plans for an independent public inquiry designed to examine the events surrounding the deaths in greater detail. Unlike a criminal trial, which focuses on determining guilt or innocence, a public inquiry aims to understand what happened, why it happened, and what lessons can be learned. Investigators in such inquiries have the authority to review documents, question witnesses, and analyze institutional decisions in ways that go beyond the scope of a courtroom proceeding. For many observers, this inquiry represented one of the most important next steps in understanding the full story. Whether the conviction ultimately remains unchanged or becomes the subject of further legal challenge, the inquiry is expected to examine the sequence of decisions made by hospital administrators, the handling of early warnings from medical staff, and the broader culture within the healthcare system during that time. Because in tragedies of this magnitude, responsibility rarely rests in a single place. Instead, it often emerges from a complex chain of decisions, assumptions, and institutional pressures that unfold over time. And as investigators continue to trace that chain, one reality has become clear. The story of what happened inside that neonatal unit is not only about one individual. It is also about the systems that were meant to protect the most vulnerable patients, and the difficult lessons that must now be learned from one of the most disturbing cases in modern medical history. As the legal battles and public debates continued, the British government announced a step that signaled just how significant the case had become. An independent public inquiry would be launched to investigate the events surrounding the deaths and collapses inside the neonatal unit. Unlike a criminal trial, which focuses on determining guilt, a public inquiry is designed to uncover the broader truth, to examine decisions, systems, and institutional failures that may have contributed to a tragedy. The inquiry was placed under the leadership of Catherine Thirlwall, a senior judge tasked with conducting a comprehensive examination of what had happened within the neonatal unit at the Countess of Chester Hospital. Her role would involve reviewing documents, hearing testimony from medical professionals and administrators, and analyzing how the hospital responded when concerns were first raised. Public inquiries of this scale can take years to complete, but they often provide insights that criminal trials cannot. In court, the focus remains narrowly centered on the actions of a specific defendant. Evidence must meet strict legal standards, and the scope of questioning is limited to what is directly relevant to the charges. An inquiry, however, is allowed to look at the bigger picture, including institutional culture, management decisions, and communication failures. One of the central questions the inquiry aimed to answer was how early warnings about the unusual pattern of baby deaths were handled. Several doctors working in the neonatal unit had reportedly raised concerns about the incidents long before the police investigation began. Some of these clinicians later stated that they felt their warnings were not taken seriously enough by hospital leadership at the time. The inquiry was expected to explore whether those warnings should have triggered a faster or more decisive response. Investigators would examine internal emails, meeting records, and medical reviews conducted during the period when the deaths were occurring. These documents could reveal how hospital leaders evaluated the information they were receiving and why certain decisions were made. Another key area of investigation involved the hospital's internal review processes. When the deaths first raised alarms, administrators sought external evaluations from medical organizations and specialists. Some of those reviews suggested that the incidents might be explained by factors such as staffing shortages or the challenges of caring for extremely premature infants. The inquiry would examine whether these early assessments influenced the delay in involving law enforcement. The testimony of medical staff would also play a critical role. Doctors, nurses, and administrators who worked in the neonatal unit during the relevant period were expected to describe the conditions inside the ward, the pressures they faced, and the discussions that took place as concerns about the deaths grew. Their accounts could help investigators reconstruct how the situation unfolded in real time. For the families of the babies involved in the case, the inquiry represented another painful chapter in a long and difficult journey. Many parents hoped that the process would finally provide a complete explanation of what had happened to their children. Some had already spent years waiting for answers before the criminal trial even began. At the same time, the inquiry carried broader implications for the healthcare system. Hospitals across the United Kingdom were watching closely, aware that the conclusions could lead to significant changes in how patient safety concerns are reported and investigated. If the inquiry identified systemic failures, it might result in new regulations, revised protocols, or increased oversight of hospital management. The investigation could also shed light on the complex relationship between medical professionals and administrators. In many hospitals, doctors and nurses rely on management structures to address serious concerns about patient safety. When communication breaks down within that system, critical warnings may not reach the people capable of initiating urgent action. Observers noted that the inquiry was not intended to challenge the criminal verdict itself. Instead, Its purpose was to understand the chain of events that allowed the situation to develop inside the hospital. However, any new evidence or revelations that emerge could potentially influence future legal discussions about the case. For now, the inquiry stands as one of the most comprehensive attempts to examine every dimension of the tragedy. It represents an effort not only to understand what happened, but also to ensure that similar events cannot occur again. Because behind every legal argument, every expert opinion, and every public debate lies a simple and devastating reality. Inside a hospital ward meant to protect the most fragile lives, a series of tragedies unfolded, and the search for the full truth about those events is still far from over. Years after the first suspicions emerged inside the neonatal ward, the case of Lucy Letby continues to cast a long shadow over both the medical world and the criminal justice system. What began as a troubling pattern of infant collapses in a single hospital has evolved into one of the most controversial and widely discussed cases in modern British history. Its impact now extends far beyond the walls of the Countess of Chester Hospital, influencing debates about healthcare safety, legal standards, and the way society responds to tragedies involving its most vulnerable patients. For the families who lost their children, the case represents an unimaginable personal loss that no investigation, trial, or inquiry can fully resolve. Many parents spent years searching for answers, first within the hospital system and later through the courts. The criminal trial brought national attention to their stories, and the verdict provided a form of acknowledgement that something deeply wrong had occurred during the care of their babies. Yet even with that recognition, the emotional consequences remain profound. Within the medical community, the case has triggered widespread reflection about patient safety and the systems used to monitor unusual clinical events. Neonatal intensive care units are environments where life and death decisions happen constantly, often involving infants born months too early and weighing only a few hundred grams. Doctors and nurses working in these settings must rely on complex technology, detailed monitoring, and close teamwork to keep their patients alive. The events that unfolded in this case forced hospitals across the United Kingdom to re-examine how they respond when unexpected patterns of deaths or medical collapses occur. Many healthcare organizations have begun reviewing their internal reporting systems, ensuring that concerns raised by clinicians are escalated quickly and investigated thoroughly. Administrators are also considering whether stronger oversight mechanisms are needed to detect unusual patterns before they escalate into crises. At the same time, the case has sparked an equally intense discussion within the legal community. Criminal trials involving medical evidence are inherently complicated. Judges and juries must interpret expert testimony about highly technical subjects such as physiology, pathology, and statistical analysis. When specialists disagree, determining which interpretation is correct becomes extraordinarily difficult. Legal scholars have pointed out that the case illustrates the challenges of presenting scientific evidence in a courtroom. Medical experts are often asked to explain complex biological processes to jurors who may have little background in medicine. Even small misunderstandings in how evidence is presented can influence how that evidence is perceived. For this reason, some experts have suggested that cases involving highly specialized medical questions may require new approaches within the justice system. These could include more extensive peer review of expert testimony, greater use of independent scientific panels, or improved methods for explaining complex data to juries. The goal of these proposals is not to change the outcome of any specific case, but to strengthen the reliability of future trials involving medical science. Meanwhile, the public inquiry led by Catherine Thirlwall continues its work, examining the institutional decisions made during the period when the deaths occurred. By analyzing hospital policies, leadership responses, and communication between staff members, the inquiry aims to identify lessons that could prevent similar tragedies in the future. The results of that inquiry may ultimately shape reforms across the National Health Service. If systemic weaknesses are identified, new policies could emerge to improve patient safety, encourage whistleblowing by medical staff, and ensure that unusual patterns of clinical incidents are investigated without delay. Yet even as these reforms are discussed, the deeper mystery surrounding the case continues to captivate public attention. For some observers, the evidence presented during the trial clearly demonstrated that deliberate harm occurred. For others, the continuing scientific debate suggests that the events inside the neonatal ward may be more complex than initially believed. This tension between certainty and doubt is part of what has made the case so enduringly controversial. In criminal law, verdicts are meant to provide closure. But when new questions continue to emerge long after a trial ends, that sense of finality becomes harder to maintain. Today, the story of Lucy Letby exists at the intersection of tragedy, science, and justice. It is a case that has forced hospitals to reconsider their systems, encouraged legal experts to examine how scientific evidence is presented in court, and reminded society how fragile truth can be when it is filtered through complex institutions. And as inquiries continue, evidence is reviewed, and debates unfold across the medical and legal worlds, one reality remains clear. The full impact of this case, on medicine, on justice, and on the families whose lives were forever changed, will continue to be felt for many years to come. In the end, the story of Lucy Letby is not only about a criminal trial or a controversial verdict, it is about how a single series of events inside a hospital ward forced an entire country to confront difficult questions about trust, responsibility, and the systems designed to protect the most vulnerable members of society. Inside the neonatal unit at the Countess of Chester Hospital, the tragedies that occurred between 2015 and 2016 changed countless lives forever. Babies who had only just entered the world suddenly became the center of a national investigation. Parents who had expected to leave the hospital with their newborns instead found themselves facing unimaginable grief. Doctors and nurses, who had dedicated their careers to saving fragile lives, were suddenly drawn into one of the most intense criminal investigations ever conducted within the British healthcare system. For the families, the case will never truly end. Court verdicts, appeals, and inquiries may provide answers, but they cannot undo the loss that occurred. Many parents have spoken about how their lives were permanently divided into two chapters: the life they had before entering that neonatal ward and the life they have lived ever since. For medical professionals, the events triggered a profound re-evaluation of how unusual medical incidents are recognized and investigated. Neonatal medicine is an environment filled with uncertainty, where premature infants can deteriorate rapidly despite the best available care. The case highlighted how difficult it can be to distinguish between tragic medical complications and patterns that might indicate something more troubling. Hospitals across the United Kingdom have since begun strengthening their monitoring systems, analyzing patient safety data more closely and encouraging staff to report concerns without hesitation. The goal is simple but crucial: to ensure that warning signs, no matter how subtle, are recognized and investigated before they escalate into larger crises. The legal system has also been deeply affected by the case. Trials involving complex medical evidence require juries to weigh competing expert opinions and interpret highly technical information. The debates surrounding this case have prompted legal scholars to ask whether courts need improved methods for presenting scientific evidence clearly and accurately. Some experts believe that future reforms may involve closer collaboration between courts and independent medical panels, allowing specialized scientific questions to be examined with greater depth. Others argue that the existing system, while imperfect, remains capable of delivering justice when evidence is carefully evaluated. Meanwhile, the public inquiry led by Catherine Thirlwall continues to investigate the institutional decisions that shaped the events leading up to the police investigation. By examining internal hospital communications, leadership responses, and the handling of early warnings, the inquiry seeks to understand not only what happened, but also why it happened. The findings of that inquiry may influence healthcare policy for years to come. Recommendations could reshape how hospitals handle whistleblowing, patient safety alerts, and internal investigations into unusual medical patterns. In this sense, the legacy of the case may ultimately extend far beyond the individuals directly involved. Yet despite all the legal rulings, expert debates, and policy discussions, one element of the story remains constant: the fragile lives at the center of it all. The babies whose short time in the world became the focus of a global investigation remind us how deeply human this story truly is. Cases like this leave lasting marks on the institutions they touch. Hospitals change their procedures, legal systems review their standards, governments launch inquiries and propose reforms. But beneath all those changes lies a more fundamental lesson, the recognition that when tragedies occur in places meant to heal and protect, society must examine every possible explanation with honesty and care. Because trust in medicine and trust in justice are among the most important foundations of any modern society. And when events challenge that trust, the search for truth becomes more than a legal process. It becomes a responsibility shared by everyone who believes that the most vulnerable lives deserve nothing less than the full and honest understanding of what happened to them. Even as years pass, the case of Lucy Letby continues to echo through the worlds of medicine, law, and public opinion. Few criminal cases in modern Britain have generated such intense discussion, not only because of the tragic deaths involved, but also because of the profound questions the case has raised about evidence, accountability, and the complexity of truth. Inside the neonatal ward of the Countess of Chester Hospital, the events that unfolded between 2015 and 2016 began quietly. At first, they appeared as isolated medical emergencies, fragile babies whose conditions suddenly deteriorated despite the efforts of doctors and nurses trying to save them. Neonatal intensive care units around the world confront similar emergencies every day, and most are understood as tragic complications of premature birth. But in this ward, something eventually began to stand out. Doctors noticed that the number of unexpected collapses seemed unusually high. Conversations began in hospital corridors and meeting rooms. Medical staff reviewed patient records, looking for patterns that might explain what they were witnessing. At that time, no one could have imagined that those early concerns would eventually lead to one of the most disturbing criminal investigations in the history of the British healthcare system. When police became involved and the case moved into the courtroom, the story transformed from a medical mystery into a criminal prosecution watched by the entire nation. The trial examined detailed clinical records, expert testimony, and the complex question of whether natural medical complications could explain the events, or whether deliberate harm had taken place. The jury ultimately reached a verdict that shocked the country and sent Letby to prison for the rest of her life. Legally, the case appeared to reach its conclusion at that moment. Yet as time passed, debates about the evidence continued to emerge, fueled by new expert opinions, academic analysis, and the ongoing public inquiry examining how the situation had been handled inside the hospital. For some observers, the conviction remains clear and justified. They believe the evidence presented during the trial demonstrated a pattern of deliberate harm that could not be explained by natural causes alone. For others, the continuing debate among medical specialists raises questions about how complex scientific evidence was interpreted during the investigation and trial. This difference in perspective is part of what has made the case so enduringly controversial. It sits at the intersection of two complicated worlds, medicine and criminal law, where absolute certainty is often difficult to achieve. Neonatal medicine deals with fragile lives and unpredictable outcomes, while criminal justice demands clear explanations for tragic events. The public inquiry now underway represents an attempt to examine the broader environment in which the tragedy occurred. Led by Catherine Thirlwall, the investigation aims to understand how early warnings were handled, how decisions were made within the hospital, and whether systemic failures played a role in the delay before police became involved. These questions matter not only for the families affected by the case, but also for the future of healthcare and patient safety. Hospitals across the country are studying the events carefully, determined to learn lessons that might prevent similar tragedies from occurring again. Yet beyond the policies, inquiries, and expert debates, the story ultimately returns to a simple and painful truth. Inside a hospital ward, where the smallest and most vulnerable patients were fighting for life, a series of devastating events unfolded. Events that would alter the lives of families, doctors, nurses, investigators, and an entire nation. Some believe the justice system has already revealed the truth of what happened. Others believe that the full story may still contain unanswered questions. What is certain, however, is that this case has become one of the most defining and unsettling chapters in modern medical and legal history. A story about fragile lives, complex evidence, and the enduring human search for truth in the aftermath of tragedy. In the end, the case of Lucy Letby stands as one of the most haunting and complex stories to emerge from modern healthcare. It began quietly inside a neonatal ward where doctors and nurses worked every day to protect the most fragile patients imaginable, newborn babies fighting for their first chance at life. Inside the Countess of Chester Hospital, those fragile lives were placed in incubators, connected to monitors and breathing support, surrounded by professionals trained to keep them alive through the most delicate stages of early human development. Neonatal units are places where medicine operates at the very edge of what science can achieve. Every heartbeat, every breath, every gram of weight gained can mean the difference between life and death. When the unusual pattern of infant collapses began to emerge, the people working inside that ward were the first to notice that something felt wrong. Doctors started reviewing records. Conversations began about whether the number of incidents could be explained by medical complications alone. What began as quiet concern among clinicians would eventually grow into one of the most significant criminal investigations the British healthcare system had ever faced. The investigation, the arrests, and the eventual trial transformed the situation into a global story. In the courtroom, jurors listened to months of testimony from medical experts, investigators, and witnesses. They examined clinical evidence, debated competing interpretations of neonatal medicine, and were asked to determine whether the tragedies had occurred naturally or through deliberate actions. Their verdict ultimately concluded that the deaths and collapses were the result of intentional harm, leading to one of the most severe sentences ever imposed in British criminal history. Legally, that decision brought the case to its conclusion. But the story did not end there. In the years that followed, discussions about the evidence continued to unfold among doctors, legal experts, journalists, and researchers. Some specialists supported the conclusions presented during the trial, while others raised questions about how certain medical findings had been interpreted. These debates revealed how difficult it can be to reach absolute certainty when medicine, statistics, and human behavior intersect. Meanwhile, the public inquiry led by Catherine Thirlwall continues examining the institutional decisions that shape the events inside the hospital. Its purpose is not to retry the criminal case, but to understand how the warning signs were handled, how communication between medical staff and management unfolded, and whether systemic failures contributed to the delay before authorities became involved. The findings of that inquiry may shape the future of healthcare oversight in the United Kingdom. Hospitals may introduce new safety protocols, improve whistleblowing systems, and strengthen the ways unusual clinical patterns are investigated. In that sense, the legacy of the case may ultimately lead to reforms designed to protect future patients. Yet for the families whose babies were at the center of the tragedy, the case will never simply become a chapter in medical or legal history. It remains a deeply personal story, one defined by loss, grief, and the search for answers about what happened during the brief lives of their children. Their voices remind us that behind every investigation, every legal argument, and every policy reform lies a human story that cannot be reduced to statistics or courtroom testimony. The case of Lucy Letby forces society to confront uncomfortable realities about the fragility of life, the complexity of medical science, and the responsibility of institutions to act when warning signs appear. It shows how easily trust can be shaken when tragedies occur in places designed to heal and protect, and perhaps most importantly, it demonstrates how the search for truth does not always end when a verdict is delivered. Sometimes, the questions raised by a tragedy continue long after the courtroom lights have dimmed, echoing through hospitals, courtrooms, and public conversations as society struggles to understand what truly happened. Because in stories like this, the pursuit of truth becomes more than a legal outcome. It becomes a lasting reminder of the responsibility we all share to protect the most vulnerable lives among us. Long after the headlines fade and the courtrooms fall silent, some stories refuse to disappear. The case of Lucy Letby is one of those stories. It remains etched into the collective memory of the United Kingdom, not only because of the shocking allegations and the tragic deaths involved, but because it exposed how fragile the systems of trust can be when tragedy unfolds inside institutions meant to save lives. Inside the neonatal ward of the Countess of Chester Hospital, doctors and nurses once focused on the delicate task of keeping premature babies alive. Every shift was filled with small victories and heartbreaking losses, the constant reality of neonatal medicine, where survival often hangs by the thinnest thread. For the staff working there, the events that unfolded between 2015 and 2016 would forever change how they viewed their profession and the environment in which they worked. For the families, the passage of time does little to ease the pain of what happened. The babies at the center of the case were only at the beginning of their lives, yet their short time in the world became the focus of one of the most intense criminal investigations in modern British history. Their stories now exist not only in medical records or court transcripts, but in the memories of parents who will carry their loss for the rest of their lives. The criminal trial that followed attempted to provide answers to those families. Jurors listened to months of testimony, examined complex medical evidence, and were asked to determine whether the tragedies had been the result of natural complications or deliberate actions. Their verdict delivered one of the most severe sentences ever imposed in a British court. Yet the debate that followed revealed how complicated the search for truth can become when science, law, and human tragedy collide. Medical experts continued to analyze the evidence. Legal scholars debated how technical testimony is presented in court. Journalists investigated the timeline of decisions made within the hospital. Each new discussion added another layer to a case that had already captured the attention of the world. Meanwhile, the ongoing public inquiry led by Catherine Thirlwall continues examining the broader institutional context in which the events occurred. Its goal is to understand how early warnings were handled, how communication between medical staff and management unfolded, and whether systemic changes are needed to prevent similar tragedies in the future. These efforts reflect an important reality. When a case reaches this level of national significance, its consequences extend far beyond the individuals directly involved. Hospitals begin to re-evaluate safety procedures. Governments examine regulatory frameworks. Professional organizations review how concerns are raised and investigated. The legacy of the case may ultimately lead to reforms that strengthen patient safety and improve the ways healthcare institutions respond to warning signs. If those changes prevent even a single future tragedy, they will stand as one of the few positive outcomes to emerge from a profoundly painful story. But beyond the policies, investigations, and legal debates lies a deeper lesson, one that transcends the details of any single case. It is the reminder that the institutions society depends on, hospitals, courts, and public systems of accountability, must constantly earn the trust placed in them. When something goes wrong within those systems, the responsibility to search for truth becomes shared by everyone involved. Doctors must ask difficult questions. Administrators must listen to concerns. Investigators must examine evidence carefully. Courts must weigh complex testimony with fairness and precision. And society itself must remain willing to confront uncomfortable truths, even when those truths challenge the narratives we first believed. The story of Lucy Letby may continue to evolve as inquiries conclude and debates about the evidence persist. But regardless of how history ultimately interprets the case, its impact has already been profound. It has forced a nation to reflect on the fragility of life, the complexity of justice, and the importance of vigilance in protecting those who cannot protect themselves. And in the quiet spaces left behind by tragedy, it reminds us that the search for truth is never simply about the past. It is about ensuring a safer future for the lives that come after. Even after the trial concluded and Lucy Letby was sentenced to spend the rest of her life in prison, the debate surrounding the case did not disappear. Instead, it slowly began shifting from the courtroom into another arena entirely, the global scientific community. Doctors, statisticians, and researchers started reviewing the medical evidence that had been presented during the trial. Some experts supported the conclusions reached by the prosecution, arguing that the patterns observed among the infants were too unusual to be explained by natural causes alone. According to them, the repeated collapses, the unusual clinical symptoms described in several cases, and the timing of certain events formed a pattern that required a deliberate explanation. However, other specialists began expressing concerns about how some of the medical findings had been interpreted during the trial. One of the central debates involved the diagnosis of air embolism, a condition in which air enters the bloodstream and can disrupt circulation. During the trial, prosecutors argued that several babies had died after air was deliberately injected into their systems. The claim was supported by expert testimony describing symptoms such as sudden collapse, skin discoloration, and abnormal medical imaging. But in the years that followed, some neonatologists questioned whether those symptoms could truly confirm air embolism. Critics pointed out that premature infants can experience sudden circulatory failures for many different reasons, including infections, lung complications, or metabolic instability. In such fragile patients, distinguishing between natural medical deterioration and external interference can be extraordinarily difficult. The debate intensified when international medical specialists began reviewing the clinical records associated with the case. Among them was Xu Li, whose earlier research had been cited during the trial as part of the discussion about air embolism. After examining how his work had been used in court, Li stated that the interpretation of his research did not fully reflect the conclusions of the original study. Concerned about the potential implications, he helped assemble a group of international neonatology experts to independently review the cases connected to the conviction. The panel examined medical records from multiple incidents that had formed the basis of the prosecution's argument. Their goal was not to determine legal guilt or innocence, but rather to evaluate whether the medical evidence clearly demonstrated deliberate harm. When the panel released its conclusions, they attracted enormous attention. According to the group's assessment, the clinical data they reviewed did not provide clear evidence that the babies had been intentionally harmed. Instead, the panel suggested that many of the medical events described in the trial could potentially be explained by natural causes, complications of extreme prematurity, or issues related to the hospital environment. The panel emphasized that neonatal medicine is inherently unpredictable, especially when dealing with extremely premature infants. Small physiological changes can escalate rapidly, sometimes producing symptoms that appear dramatic or unexplained even to experienced clinicians. These findings immediately reignited debate around the case. Supporters of the conviction argued that the international review was incomplete and that the jury had already heard extensive expert testimony before reaching its verdict. They emphasized that courts rely on the evidence presented during the trial, not on analyses conducted afterward. Others, however, saw the panel's conclusions as evidence that the case deserved deeper examination. Legal analysts noted that disputes over scientific evidence are not uncommon in complex medical cases. Throughout history, several convictions involving healthcare workers have later been reconsidered after new scientific interpretations emerged. The question now facing observers is not simply whether the original trial was conducted fairly, but whether evolving medical analysis could eventually influence future legal discussions about the case. For now, the conviction remains in place, but the debate within the scientific community has ensured that the story is far from finished. Because when medicine and law intersect, certainty can sometimes prove more fragile than it first appears. In the years following the conviction of Lucy Letby, one aspect of the case continued to generate intense discussion among experts: the question of statistics. While the courtroom had focused heavily on medical testimony and clinical evidence, many analysts later turned their attention to the patterns that first triggered suspicion inside the neonatal unit. When doctors working at the Countess of Chester Hospital began reviewing the sudden collapses and deaths of babies in 2015 and 2016, they noticed something that seemed unusual. A number of the most serious incidents had occurred during shifts when Letby was present. In the context of the investigation, this observation became one of the factors that helped authorities focus their attention on her. During the trial, prosecutors argued that the repeated overlap between Letby's shifts and the medical emergencies was unlikely to be a coincidence. According to their interpretation, the pattern suggested that the incidents were connected to her presence on the ward. However, after the trial concluded, statisticians began examining how such patterns can appear in environments like hospitals. Medical units often operate with relatively small teams of staff who work overlapping shifts, respond to the same emergencies, and share responsibility for patient care. In such settings, it is not uncommon for certain individuals to appear repeatedly in medical records connected to critical incidents simply because they are among the most frequently scheduled staff members. Some statisticians warn that interpreting patterns within small datasets can be extremely misleading. When the number of cases is limited, random clustering can sometimes produce patterns that appear suspicious even when no deliberate action has occurred. This phenomenon is known in statistical science as the clustering illusion, where events that happen close together in time or place can seem meaningful even when they arise purely by chance. These concerns are not theoretical. In previous decades, several healthcare workers in different countries were convicted partly based on statistical interpretations of patient deaths, only for those convictions to later be questioned when the statistical methods used during the trials were reassessed. Because of these historical precedents, some analysts believe that statistical evidence should be treated with extreme caution in criminal trials involving healthcare settings. They argue that patterns must always be examined alongside strong medical or forensic evidence before drawing conclusions about intent. Supporters of the conviction, however, emphasize that the case against Letby did not rely on statistics alone. During the trial, prosecutors presented medical testimony describing specific clinical findings they believed indicated deliberate harm. In their view, the statistical pattern was simply one part of a much larger body of evidence considered by the jury. This disagreement highlights the fundamental challenge at the heart of the case. Medicine deals with uncertainty. Statistics deals with probability. But criminal law demands conclusions that must ultimately be clear enough for a jury to reach a verdict beyond reasonable doubt. When these three worlds collide, the search for certainty becomes extraordinarily complicated. Today, Lucy Letby remains imprisoned, serving one of the most severe sentences ever imposed in the United Kingdom. Legally, the verdict delivered by the court still stands. At the same time, ongoing discussions among medical experts, statisticians, and legal scholars show that the case continues to provoke difficult questions about how evidence is interpreted when lives, science, and justice intersect. Meanwhile, the public inquiry led by Catherine Thirlwall continues examining how the situation inside the hospital developed and whether systemic changes are needed to prevent future tragedies. For the families who lost their children, the passage of time does not change the profound impact of what happened. Their search for understanding and accountability remains at the center of the story. And for society, the case has become something larger than a single criminal trial. It is now a reminder of how fragile certainty can be when complex science meets human tragedy. Because in the end, even after investigations, courtrooms, and years of debate, one question continues to linger in the background of this extraordinary case. Did the justice system uncover the truth of what happened inside that neonatal ward? Or is the full story still waiting to be completely understood